We're across the street today at the Saban Research Institute, and we're visiting with Dr. Tracy Griegscheid in her laboratory here in this marvelous facility. I think most of you know Tracy as the surgical director of our intestinal rehab program, and she's been working for many years on a project that is near and dear to all of us interested in intestinal rehab, which is how to make new intestine in the laboratory. She's going to take us on a bit of a tour today, tell us about what people in her lab are doing and what we can look forward to in the future. Tracy, welcome to Intestinal Rehab Day, and thank you for working us into your very busy schedule. I know you couldn't be available on the day we're actually having this meeting.
Thanks, Russ. I'm really sorry to miss Intestinal Failure Day, and I'm really grateful to be included. And I thought it would be fun if we could take a tour of the G unit, which is my lab, and talk a little bit about tissue-engineered intestine and our plans in the future to try to make lives better for children who have intestinal failure. So I want to introduce you to a few people in my lab, but first we were going to talk a little bit about how we make tissue-engineered intestine.
I think one of the things that's interesting for me, and I don't get into your lab very often, and here I am today looking at all of this and all the people involved. I suspect something like this didn't happen overnight.
No, I've been working on this for more than a decade. I began working on it when I was in Boston, working at Mass General Hospital under Jay Vacanti, and this project has just evolved and continued. I've been at Children's Hospital Los Angeles for 7 years now, and we just began a new grant this January. For the next 5 years, we're going to be working very hard to get some of the data that will help us to understand how to go for clinical trials.
But how did you as a surgeon get so heavy into research and into such a highly technical, novel area? I mean, that seems unusual to me for people coming through surgical training, learning how to take care of patients.
I mean, I think the simple answer is that we take care of patients, and especially patients who need surgery end up losing part of their bodies. As a surgeon, you end up taking out part of their intestine or their liver, and right now, surgeons have two ways of managing that. We can either put in something man-made, like a G-tube, where we have a piece of plastic that's acting as a conduit, or we can do surgery where we've simply taken it out and the child needs to live without that organ. So it makes a lot of sense that surgeons have a huge interest in trying to grow back those organs that we often have to remove because either the child is born without it or it's diseased and it needs to come out.
So where are we in this process? The news is full every day of major technological breakthroughs in lots of different fields, and I think we get a little impatient for having answers to the problems we're interested in. Do you think patients growing up in this generation are going to reap the benefits of what we see going on in this laboratory?
I mean, I've made a decision to devote my career to this, and it was a conscious decision based on the fact that I think it's going to work. And I picked this as a topic not only because I've taken care of so many of these patients, and I understand their stories and that we need better solutions for children who have intestinal failure, but also because the state of the science is such that I hope in my lifetime that we are going to see the first babies who recover from intestinal failure with tissue-engineered intestine. And I think it's important to be very clear that we don't have clinical trials yet, and that is the absolute objective of my lab. And that's something that we have to do in a very safe manner so that we have it quantified and qualified and make sure that when we are able to deliver this to babies, we know it's going to work, we know it's going to be safe, and that we can have a good conversation with the family so that they have the right expectations.
When I'm working with families and trying to give them a roadmap of the future, particularly in kiddos where maybe there are a lot of complications and our usual approaches aren't working well, how would you kind of compare and contrast where this therapy is compared to intestinal transplantation today for patients with these kinds of intestinal failure problems and short gut?
I think we don't know. I mean, I don't think we'll know until we are able to start the first clinical trials, which are years away. And I think just like medicine always, first you have one antibiotic, you have penicillin, and then you add on all of the other antibiotics that are good at treating different conditions. I certainly don't see that we're going to replace intestine transplant entirely. I see this as being something extra that we can do, and maybe in some children it will work better than transplant, or through this they could avoid transplant. But I don't see it as, curing every single baby with intestinal failure. I see it as an available option that we hope to make ready in the hospital.
Well, maybe that's a good place to begin to show us kind of where you are in this process here with folks in your laboratory.
Sure. We'd love to show you the advantages that our tissue has, and also to show you some of the problems that we have to work on. Our plan to make tissue-engineered intestine is very simple. Most babies who need to have a new piece of intestine will also have to have surgery on their intestine. This won't be available for a few years, but the overall plan is after the intestine's removed, it will go through a machine. The machine will bring out some cellular clusters, and it will be implanted on a material just like this. It's made of the same material that's in sutures that absorb naturally in the body. So as this biodegrades, becomes water, and disappears entirely from the body, a piece of tissue-engineered intestine should remain. And that would be an additional piece of intestine, we hope, that we could then connect up for the baby to use. I want to introduce some of the members of my lab and talk about some of the details that we're working on. Zhao, what are you working on?
Currently, I'm working on culturing the human intestine tissues to preserve stem cells. One, the kid is very sick and he's not available for implantation. We must find a way to preserve the tissue, including the stem cells. And we are pretty successful to maintain it to several months. That will be very important for future tissue engineering small intestine.
Making sure that we can save these precious stem cells is important in our lab. And now that we know we can preserve them for a few months and also freeze them and later see that the cells will still work to grow engineered intestine have been major accomplishments for the lab in the last year. But the other thing we need to make sure is that the tissue engineered intestine will have good function. Krista, come tell us about what you're working on.
Okay. In order for tissue-engineered small intestine to provide a solution for children with short bowel syndrome, we have to make sure that it functions just as well as a child's normal intestine would. So I've been working on the functionality of tissue-engineered small intestine. This means we're testing it to see if it would have the ability to absorb sugar, to absorb water, and to be a barrier to keep the outside out and the inside in.
Making sure that the tissue-engineered intestine will function well is critical because we don't want this solution to last just for a few weeks or months. We want it to last for the child's lifetime. Another thing that has to last the child's lifetime is a good nervous system in the tissue-engineered intestine. Wael, can you tell us a little bit about the nervous system of tissue-engineered intestine?
Sure. A lot of people don't realize that the intestine has a very complex nervous system within it, so much so that scientists who study it refer to it as our second brain. My job in this lab is to examine the nervous system within tissue-engineered intestine to make sure that all the right cells are there, so that when the time comes, the tissue-engineered intestine functions like a normal intestine.
Even though we are still not ready to treat babies, we can make tissue-engineered intestine from cells that come out after human surgery. When we look at the neurons and the innervation, parts of the nervous system in the tissue-engineered intestine, we're finding many of the nerve types that should be, both the types that work for motory and for sensory, the nerves that see what's coming down the pipeline and the nerves that make the pipeline move. However, children who have intestinal failure may suffer from other problems, and one of these is liver failure. So as we've been learning lessons about engineering intestine, we are also seeing if we could help out by working on engineering portions of the liver. Ryan, tell us a little bit about your work on another organ system.
Many children with intestinal failure will go on to need nutrition through an IV, something often referred to as TPN. One of the unfortunate side effects of TPN can be liver failure. In order to try to treat that disease, we're using similar techniques as with tissue-engineered intestine to generate tissue-engineered liver.
This lab will always make its first priority to make good tissue-engineered intestine for babies who need it. However, as we're making tissue-engineered liver and components of other organs, we're learning important lessons that will help us to make better tissue-engineered intestine. And in addition, some children may need more than just intestinal replacement alone, and we'd like to be able to give back some liver function if we get to that point with the science. Both tissue-engineered liver and tissue-engineered intestine need to have a great blood supply in order to grow with the baby and in order to survive for decades. One of the people who's working on that aspect of the project is Sal. Sal, tell us a little bit about the blood supply in tissue-engineered intestine.
In order to make sure that the intestine grows properly and it has all of the correct nutrients, we have to make sure that it has enough blood supply. So I'm working and studying different proteins that can actually help the blood vessels form in the new intestine.
Beyond the blood supply, another factor that will keep tissue-engineered intestine and any tissue-engineered organ regenerative and continuing to grow are the stem cells. Kathy Shaw has been working on the stem cells in our lab, and she's going to come and tell us a little bit about the mama cells that keep the babies happy.
The intestine is made up of many different cell types that all function together, thus forming a neighborhood. Within the neighborhood are the rambunctious teenagers, the small children, mothers, and of course the snoopy neighbors. The difference is, however, is that all of these various cell types all come from the same mama cell. My work here has been focused on finding the mechanism to make these mama cells happy so they'll produce more offspring and therefore more intestinal tissue to therefore help children with short bowel syndrome in the future.
Thank you very much for coming to visit my lab and listening to the members of my lab describe our progress working on tissue engineering organs. Although we're not ready for clinical trials yet, that is our goal, and you can keep in touch with the lab either through the webpage or the Intestinal Failure Program at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles.